Hey there, friends, and welcome to episode 183 of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. Today, we are going to dive into a conversation about reading books, but we are going to tie it into why it can sometimes be so hard to consistently show up for a movement, self kindness, self care practice, and see what we can learn from a very thick book. All right, so how are you, friends? I hope that you are doing well. Today, we're going to be talking about a book. We're not actually going to go into the book at all, but I want to use this book and the idea of reading books as a little bit of a metaphor or a little bit of a lesson place that we can kind of take some lessons from to apply to our movement, self-kindness and self-care habits, because sometimes it can kind of strike us in a different way when we look at it through a slightly different lens. And this idea came to me because I'm reading this book at the moment. Now, if you're watching this with the visual over on YouTube, you will be able to see what I'm holding up. For those of you who cannot see, I'm reading a book at the moment that's called The Labyrinth of the Spirits by a author called Carlos Ruiz Zafón. I may not have said that exactly correctly. And he is the author of my favorite book called The Shadow of the Wind. And this is like the follow-up. It is the most hefty book, though. It's over 800 pages long. And I don't know exactly what I was thinking, but I purchased this book to take with me on the plane to Los Angeles. I just carried the book around. I didn't even open it. I carried it all the way there. I carried it all the way around when I was sort of moving from one hotel to another. And then I carried it all the way home and I never opened it. And in hindsight, it was the worst book possible to take traveling because it is just massive. It's so thick. And it's 800 pages of very, small writing. So it's a big, hefty book. And I finally picked it up. I'm not all that far through it. I'm probably like a quarter of the way through. Um, but it's just a really big book. And I wanted to sort of talk about some of the lessons that we can learn from reading that we can apply to movement. Now, it actually doesn't matter if you're not a reader. I think that this will still make really good sense. And you might even have some other activity that you do in your life that kind of makes sense through this same lens. So I've got like 4 lessons. There might be more as we go, but I've got 4 written down that I want to share with you. And I'm going to share them from the perspective of sort of like reading, and then I'm going to link it to how this might impact on our self-care, kindness, movement practices, and hopefully some tangible things in there as well to be able to actually move forward. So, the first one, I mentioned that this book is like 800 pages plus. So it's big, right? Um, it doesn't have to be that big for this one to apply, but the enormity of a task like reading an 800-page long book can make it very, very hard to start, right? Because like you just take one look at it and you're like, how many months is this going to take me? How will I still be reading this in December 2023? And so the enormity of what we perceive the task to be can stop us before we even begin. And I think that's what happened when I hefted this book all the way to LA and back. Was in my mind, it seemed like I would have like so much time to read because I was going to be on this 15-hour flight. I was going to be in my hotel at night and I was going to have all this time to read. The reality is that I didn't really have the mental bandwidth for it at the time. And I was like stuck in seats next to people, didn't really want to go through my bag, get my book. It was dark on the plane. There were all these reasons why I didn't open it. But I think part of it also is just this recognition of like, this is a big task. 800 pages is going to take me a really long time. And do I want to invest that time? How long is this going to take? And I think that particularly as we get older, and I was talking to my husband about this recently actually, there is a recognition that we're not working with movement in order to like bring back factory settings, right? We are not attempting to get back to the way that perhaps our bodies felt at 20. Now maybe we are, I don't know. You can disagree with me if you want to about that, but I think there's a recognition that as we get older, we are dealing with more stuff. psychological stuff that is impacting the way that we feel, the mental load of families and work and all of that stuff obviously impacts on our body, and our body impacts on our body in terms of the habits that we've had for years, the way that we use our body, the ways that we've stopped using our body, the degeneration if that's happening for us as well. And so there's this recognition that actually what we're doing with movement and self-care practices isn't trying to go from A to B. It's going from A to, you know, the alphabet doesn't work for this analogy because it has an end point, but like, let's think numbers, right? It's like going from one to it never ends. It is a lifelong practice because we're constantly both preempting and being in response to the way that we feel. Looking after ourselves doesn't have an end point. There isn't a point where we go, cool, got this, moving on, right? There's always things that we're responding to. There's new seasons of life. There's new symptoms. There's new experiences. There's new things that impact the way that we feel. And consequently, we are in response to those things for a lifetime. And I think sometimes the reason that it's so hard to begin with movement or so hard to persist with movement is because that lens is so long. And it's actually hard to comprehend, especially through that traditional fitness model that places intensity over sustainability. It can be very hard to understand how we could possibly sustain that over a lifetime. And so I think one of the things that we learn from, picking up a book, or even looking at a book on a bookshelf at the library or at the bookshop and being like, recognizing that sometimes it's simply the enormity of the task and the belief that we have that sometimes the point of something is to reach the end of that thing, which is actually point two. So what a lovely segue. One of the questions that I found myself asking myself when I picked up this book, so I've been reading it for a little while now, but one of the questions that I asked myself last night when I picked up the book, because I have this habit, right? And I don't know if you do this too, of like flicking forward to see how long is this chapter? Like, how long is it going to take me to finish this chapter? And part of that is because, I want to read just a little bit before I go to sleep. But part of it as well is this way of thinking of like completion, right? Completion or end point over process. And I know I'm very much wired like that. That's definitely how I think. I'm like, how do I finish this as opposed to how do I enjoy the process? And that's something that I have to be very conscious about. And so the question that I ask for all of us, and you can insert reading with any other, you can like swap that out for any other word. Am I reading this book to finish the book or because I want to experience the book? Am I reading this book to finish the book or am I reading it to experience the book? And we could ask the same question of our movement. Am I doing this movement practice to finish this movement practice and to get whatever outcome it is that I think I'm working for? Or am I doing this movement practice to experience the movement practice or to experience myself in a different way or to embody myself or to explore my body? The answer might be both. It might be that there's some days where I'm like, yeah, I'm literally just moving to get this done, right? And I totally get that. I'm studying at the moment and some days I'm literally just reading stuff to get to the end of that paragraph, right? But and same with books, right? There's some things that you pick up and you're like, I just got to get through this. And then there's other times where you're like, no, I really want to experience this. I'm experiencing this because this is the thing that's bringing me joy, or this is the thing that is allowing me to explore some element of life, myself, my relationships, whatever it might be. And so I think that's a really interesting and important question. Am I doing this thing to just get to the end? Or am I doing this thing to experience something about the process? And it's okay if we can't always be in the process. That's very normal. That's very human. But if we're never doing it to experience the process, then I think that's a very quick way for that thing to feel like a chore. And the last thing we want is for our movement and self-care practices to always feel like a chore. because that's not why they're there, right? That's not why we do them. We don't do them so that we have another thing to do, because quite frankly, we have enough things to do. We do them so that we have more capacity for doing the other things in our life. We do them so that we feel more comfortable in our own body, in our own skin, in our own capacity. So really sort of sitting with that question of like, why am I doing this? Am I picking up this book? Am I moving into this movement practice just because I've already got my eye on the end of it? Or, what element of this process can I enjoy? And I think when we're talking about a fiction book, this almost brings that into much more stark relief. I don't even know if that's the right term. But like, why else would you pick up a book of fiction? You could, if you're watching this on video, you can probably see that I have some bookshelves behind me, and they span the whole one side of this room. So like, I love reading. I don't love it as much as I used to, though, and I find that in this stage of my life, it's actually a lot harder to do. But I'm there for the joy of it. I'm there because I want to be immersed in a story. I'm not there because I want to finish the book, even though sometimes my brain will trick me into thinking that's true. And same with movement. I'm not there just to finish that process. I'm there to learn more about myself. I'm there to experience my body. I'm there to care for my body. And they're very different things. All right, number 3. We talk often about this idea of like all movement counting, right? That it doesn't matter if it's 5 minutes, it still counts as something. We don't have to have that all or nothing mindset around movement and self-care and what counts and what doesn't. And I think that there's a really lovely contrast of that in reading a book, because that if you pick up a book and you read one sentence, you've still read one sentence. It's very tangible. You can, I read from here to here. One paragraph makes a difference. One page makes a difference. One chapter makes a difference. And when we're talking about an 800-page book, perhaps, one page feels like you really haven't made a dent in it. But you do that every day for 800 days and you finished a book. Now, I know that 800 days is rather a long time, but it's still progress, right? It's still more than nothing. And even though that's a very simple concept to comprehend, that something is more than nothing, we still will have our brains trick us into thinking that something isn't something until it's, hits this particular benchmark that we've decided makes it enough. And so I think that sometimes reading or books can really help us to recognize that something really is something and it can be enough. I think sometimes, this idea of like committing to something can feel scary, because if I'm committing to a daily movement practice, then I've committed to finding 1 hour every day. But what if it didn't mean that, right? Like, what if it meant that most times I'm going to try to find this block of time, but there's going to be days where it's a 30-second nod to movement before I go to bed, or it's a walk around the office, or it's a walk around the block, because that's all I can do in that moment and in that day. And allowing that to be enough, and recognizing that that is commitment, that is consistency, not only when we show up for the, quote unquote, perfect version of what we believe it to be. And I think reading gives us a really lovely, example of that. And then the fourth one, if you read books, when you finish a book, do you put the book down and go, well, I'm done now? That is it. Reading is done. I will not pick up another book for the rest of my life. Finished. Probably not. Because if you have picked up a book, you probably identify as being a reader. You identify as someone who enjoys reading, who has books, who is going to continue doing that. Yeah, there might be some, gap between books or whatever, but you identify on some level as being a reader, and you know that you're probably going to pick up books for the rest of your life. And movement, self-care, self-kindness, it's the same, because, and there's two things that I want to point out about this, but first of all, again, that kind of traditional, typical fitness culture would have us believe that we solve problems in 30, 60, 90-day cycles, right? That we just need the next shred. We just need the next challenge. And once we're finished that, then good, we're back to scratch. Or just when I get fit, right? When I get fit, whatever that means, whatever that benchmark is for us, or once I'm healthy enough, or once I'm whatever enough. And we set these kind of like very vague ideas of what completion means. But really your body needs movement forever. Your body needs physical input and output forever, for a lifetime. And so having that approach of like, well, I've put down this book, I've finished this particular thing, but I know I'm going to pick up a book again because I'm a reader. And it means that no matter how long we go between books, between chapters, whatever, it's never a complete mystery to get back into that habit because it's part of who we are. It's part of who we are. It's part of our identity. And our identity can change over a lifetime. Absolutely, it can. And so, one of the most powerful things that we can do for ourselves is to start to identify as someone who takes care of themselves, as someone who meets themselves with self-care practices, as someone who meets themselves with self-kindness, as someone who commits to movement on the regular. And that makes it so much easier then when we're not doing those things to go back to them because it's part of who we are, right? It's inbuilt into our identity, even if we have to work towards building that identity up. And we do that through showing up for it, through practice, through those little moments of showing up for things that we maybe before wouldn't have deemed enough, but through this new lens recognize, yeah, this counts, this matters, this is something and it matters. um I think, did I do two things with that one? I now don't remember. But so this idea of it being like embedded in our identity is really important, but also just recognizing that there isn't kind of like a number of books that you will read to sort of signal the end. And there's not a number of movement sessions or self-care practices that goes, okay, now you've done enough and now you're done. Right? It's this process of like, what can I sustain over a lifetime? And it doesn't mean that those practices will be the same. I went through a period where I didn't touch fiction for years, even though the bulk of the books behind me, although not the ones that you can see if you're watching on video, the bulk of these books are fiction. That is my first love is fiction books. I adore them. But I went through a period of honestly several years where I didn't touch a fiction book. I couldn't even open them. I was just like, my brain was just not there for that activity. But I read a lot of nonfiction. I did a lot of not reading. But I also knew that, you know, that didn't mean I was never going to read again, right? We have this way of going down this black and white, all or nothing sort of thinking again. It's like, well, I stopped reading, so I guess I don't read anymore, or I stopped exercising, so I guess that's it for me. And it doesn't do us any favors because it just helps us to feel, like a victim to ourselves, and that's, doesn't really move us anywhere. And so recognizing that, it's just one book. It's just one movement practice. We're going to show up again tomorrow. We're going to read another book. We're going to, explore more movement modalities. I think that's really valuable. I only had 4 points written down, but I've just thought of another one that I actually really want to share. So the fifth one is genre, right? So when it comes to books, I just mentioned that for a long time I like put fiction down. I was like, cannot do it. My attention span was just like shot. I could not focus on fiction, but I could read nonfiction. And does that make me more or less of a reader? Does that make me, more worthy, less worthy? No, it really doesn't. Whether I'm reading like romance or literary fiction or the encyclopedia or some sort of anatomy book, it doesn't speak to my worth, right? It doesn't speak to my inherent worthiness as a human. And when it comes to movement, for whatever reason, we might have these various modalities on a pedestal, right? Or on we might kind of like hierarchy them, have them on a hierarchical kind of system. I am not going to pick up a book and read a book that I detest, right? I'm trying to think of a genre that I don't love. I actually have got like a lot of Stephen King on my shelf, but that's not my favorite genre. Like horror kind of stuff is not my favorite genre. Neither is romance actually, and neither is like, no, I read a little bit of sci-fi, but not a lot, right? So, or like fantasy, I don't read a lot of that. Why would I, when there are so many books to choose from, why would I read a book that I don't enjoy? Why? Likewise, there are so many ways to move your body. There are so many ways to meet yourself with kindness. There are so many ways to give yourself care. We do not have to subscribe to somebody else's version of what that should look like, right? If you don't love running, don't let it be that, right? If you don't love yoga, don't force yourself for it to be that. If you don't love whatever, XYZ, don't force yourself for it to be that. You can find so many options. Like, we are spoiled for choice, especially in this day and age where you can access so much of it online as well, right? You do not have to do things that do not bring you some level of pleasure. Now, there are some things that perhaps we just see as like non-negotiable. Like, we want to be strengthening our bodies. We want to be engaging in some sort of, cardiovascular effort at, like there's guidelines for all these things, of course. But does that mean that there's only one way to fulfill those needs? No. No, 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 no. Just like to be a reader doesn't mean I have to be reading any specific type of text. I can kind of flex those muscles or exercise that process through any old genre I like. And I don't have to stick with one. I can read a whole bunch of books at the same time. I can be, crossing my genres. I can like one genre now and then try a different genre tomorrow. I can recognize that back in my youth, I loved horror. I loved it. And now not so much. Does it matter? Right? And the same with our movement. Maybe you used to love running and now you're like, the thought of it just makes me want to cry. So don't do it. Find something else. Can you walk? Can you, ride your bike? Can you do whatever? Don't love yoga. Maybe try a different teacher. Maybe try a different, mode or style or location. Like, we have so much access to choice around that sort of stuff. So we do not have to be locked in. So they're my 5 points. I hope they are useful. I hope they give you some food for thought. I really loved this. I don't know, is it a metaphor, an analogy? Maybe an analogy. I think it really landed a few ideas for me, and I hope that it does for you as well. Let me know. You can come over and find me on Instagram. I'm at Erica Webb _SelfKind, and I very rarely kind of like ask for things at the end of the episodes, but I would love if you are listening to this over on a podcast platform, to go ahead and leave me a review if you're able to. I do think that the only place you can do that is actually over on Apple Podcasts. So if you look up SelfKind with Erica Webb, and SelfKind is one word, and just like take the 30 seconds it takes to like rate and review the show, it would mean the world to me. If you're on YouTube, you can, stick a comment underneath and subscribe to the channel. I hope you are having a lovely week. Come and share your thoughts with me, your questions, your requests for future episodes, and I will look forward to talking to you again next week. Take care.